Okay, with that, we're going to move on to the next part of our program. We're going to hear from Khaya Eisenberg, who very openly reached out and said, this is what I'm writing a doctorate on this topic, and it comes up from our Masechet, and I really love to talk about this scene. So Khaya is basically a clinical psychologist doing a PhD specifically on issues about navigating conflicts between halacha and professional ethics. And we're going to hear from Khaya from a sugya that comes up from the beginning of the Masechet about this topic.
Thank you so much. Mazel tov, everyone. Thank you so much to Rabbanit Michelle and to Hadran for the opportunity to speak here. I began learning the daf in January 2020, and it's been a really wonderful addition to my life. And I'm very grateful to Rabbanit Michelle and to Hadran for making it so accessible to us. So, as Rabbanit Michelle mentioned, I'm a clinical psychologist and I'm writing a dissertation now on navigating professional ethics as an Orthodox Jewish psychologist. And our Masechet makes an appearance, an important appearance in my dissertation, and I'm excited to talk about it and to share it with you. So, I'm just going to share a PowerPoint that I prepared. Okay, let me just see if I can move the slide. Okay. So, psychologists, like all professionals, are obligated to adhere to a code of ethics. Ethical codes for professionals developed because there's a power differential between a professional and a client. A professional has a certain expertise that the client doesn't have, and this can allow the professional to mislead or exploit the client without the client being aware of it. The obligation to adhere to professional ethics codes is meant to offset that danger. In Western culture, one of the fundamental principles of professional psychology ethics is the obligation to respect a client's autonomy and self determination. So, yes, the psychologist is the professional, and the psychologist is guiding the client in improving their mental health. And at the same time, the psychologist remains mindful of professional ethics. And unless there's a serious risk of harm, psychologists are obligated to encourage their clients to make their own decisions. Psychologists are not meant to push clients in a particular direction. And this is the case even when the psychologist strongly disagrees with a choice that a client is making. Halacha, on the other hand, mandates obedience first to God and to his Torah. Adherence to halacha is prioritized over respecting a client's autonomy. Now, it's true that a professional has a halachic obligation to serve his client ethically based on the inherent promise in agreeing to work for the client. But when a professional and a client are both Jewish, they are viewed as equal members of the same community when it comes to obeying halacha. Halacha does not acknowledge a special obligation for a professional to respect a client's autonomy as part of the professional relationship. Now, in practice, professional psychology norms and halachic obligations don't often conflict. And when these norms conflict, the conflict is usually not intractable. So, for example, pikuach nefesh and safek pikuach nefesh are prioritized by halacha. And in the field of mental health, these concepts are actually very broadly defined. That means that there's quite a bit of wiggle room when a client needs to violate certain halachic obligations in order to protect his mental health. You think about kibbud av va'em, right? Classically, psychotherapy encourages a client to reflect critically on his upbringing and possibly critique his parents. And this would seem like a conflict. And yet, these conflicts are more resolved, usually, more easily than one would think. But sometimes these conflicts are more complex. So our Masechet on Daf Vav talks about the prohibition against doing business with an idol worshiper 3 days before his religious holiday. The rabbis discuss the reason for this prohibition, and they suggest that if the transaction supplies the idol worshiper with an object that he can then use for idol worship, such as an animal, then the person who is supplying this object may be guilty of Lifnei Iver. The Gemara then explains the prohibitions of Lifnei Iver lo titein michshol and misayeh lidvar avera. These prohibitions refer to the forbidden behavior of helping another person commit a sin. Lifnei Iver, a more serious Doraita prohibition, is introduced with an example. A description of a Nazir who is separated from a forbidden glass of wine by a river. An individual who provides the wine for the Nazir to drink is guilty of a serious offense because the Nazir is incapable of obtaining the wine without the person's help. We extrapolate from this example of Trei Avra de Nahara, two banks of the river, that it is a serious transgression to help a person commit a sin when that person cannot commit the sin without your assistance. A less strict Rabbanan prohibition, Misayea Lidvar Avera, refers to the situation of providing assistance to a sinner who is capable of committing the sin without your help. In the language of the Gemara, this is a situation of Chad Avra. The Nazir is on the same side of the river as the wine and can get it himself if he chooses. In a situation of Misayea Lidvar Avera, although helping the person commit the sin is still a transgression of halacha, it's a lesser transgression and it may be dealt with more flexibly when there are extenuating circumstances. Let's consider how the prohibition of Lifnei Iver and Misayea Lidvar Avera might conflict with the professional obligation for a psychologist to respect a client's self-determination in a psychotherapy setting. For example, can a halacha observant psychologist provide marital counseling to a couple if he has discovered that they are participating in a halachically illicit union? If an Orthodox Jewish client is experiencing scrupulosity, a form of religious OCD, can his therapist help him complete exposures that teach him to tolerate being less meticulous in his religious observance? When a psychologist learns that his client is violating religious commandments and responds to this with professional neutrality that the client interprets as validation and approval, is the psychologist guilty of contributing to the client's sinful behavior? Although halacha does hold people personally responsible for their own actions, halacha also recognizes a relational piece and the fact that somebody can have a share or some responsibility in somebody else's wrongdoing. So, if in providing psychotherapy to a client who's engaged in sinful behavior, I am in some way halachically complicit in his actions, then it matters whether my complicity is lifnei iver doraisa or misayea lidvar avera derabanan. If the therapy I'm providing is misayea lidvar avera, there might be more allowances for what I'm permitted to do in order to preserve my license and my livelihood, and some room to err on the side of leniency if it's uncertain whether I'm actually transgressing this mitzvah. But if in providing psychotherapy to a client, I'm guilty of Lifnei Iver, then that's more serious. And I need to be more sensitive to and cautious about the way clients use my guidance. So this is, of course, not a psak halacha. I'm not qualified to give one. And halacha does tend to be very contextual and case-based. But I'm going to share my reflections on two possible justifications for considering a therapist's complicity in a therapy client's sinful behavior to be misayea lidvar avera derabanan rather than lifnei iver doraisa. So first of all, the client can choose from any number of therapists. He doesn't necessarily need to see this one. Clients also have multiple sources of information, especially in today's day and age. So in my view, a client is not wholly dependent on a therapist's guidance. And second, I think about the case of a therapist I know who was helping his client overcome a phobia of driving. The therapist recommended that his client engage in a graduated series of exposures to driving, beginning with sitting in his parked car in the driveway and turning on the engine. The client was Jewish, not religious, and immediately said, "Great, I'll start this Saturday." Was this therapist guilty of Lifnei Iver? Well, even in cases where therapists do give direct instruction in therapy, the client has a great deal of autonomy regarding whether and how to follow these instructions. A client who's choosing to violate halacha when following his therapist's instructions is usually doing so of his own volition, although admittedly there are more complicated cases. Sex therapy is a little bit more complicated because there is more dependence on the therapist's instruction. So, one of the things that I find so fascinating about this topic is that the question of client autonomy illustrates a significant values difference between professional ethics and halacha. Western professional ethics classically prioritizes autonomy and leaves little room to challenge a client when you believe his behavior is wrong. Halacha is more nuanced about this issue. But recently, some secular ethicists have been advocating for psychologists to be more open to challenging their clients' ethical behavior. They argue that psychologists should be striving for more balance between, on the one hand, yes, respecting autonomy, but also raising the client's awareness of his obligations to others. This position suggests that, in their view, maybe psychologists do share a little bit of ethical responsibility for the actions of their clients. And this ethical view has already been much discussed and reflected upon in halacha. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your professional expertise and personal experience. We really appreciate it. It's one of the things we love at Hadran, and everybody takes the daf and connects it with their lives and takes it to a new place and enriches everybody else.